Good morning. Thank you for joining the Maryland Chamber Foundation for the third in our six-part series, Promoting Equity and Inclusion in the Workplace, sponsored by BG&E. I'm Christine Ross, the President and CEO of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce and the Maryland Chamber Foundation. This series is designed to showcase best practices for programming equity and inclusion in the workplace and features business leaders from across Maryland whose companies are already doing their part to drive systemic change in their organizations and in their communities. Today's program is entitled Inclusive Economic and Workforce Development, Good for Growth, Good for Communities. As business leaders face the challenge of reconciling rising growth and rising inequality, the concept of inclusive economic and workforce development initiatives has emerged as the solution to the problem. Our speakers will share approaches focused on growth and mutually beneficial outcomes for businesses, communities, and workers, including those in historically underinvested groups. Joining us this morning, we are so pleased to welcome Sarah Hemminger, CEO of Thread, an organization whose mission is to harness the power of relationships to create a new social fabric of diverse individuals deeply engaged with young people facing the most significant opportunity and achievement gaps. Also with us is Joe Jones, the CEO of the Center for Urban Families, which focuses on helping fathers and families achieve stability and economic success. And also with us is Robert Matthews, BG&E's Vice President for Workforce Development and Chief of Staff for Exelon Utilities, who will describe why Exelon Utilities is committed to designing workforce development programs in the communities they serve. And as you can see by my t-shirt, I'm representing an organization called Keep It Equal, a Baltimore-based brand. They seek to inspire and unify communities from all walks of life. One way they are doing this is by building relationships with the homeless community by providing clothing. Currently, they are in the early phases of their growth and are focused on building awareness via the sales of their beautiful shirts. Thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation. I'm going to kick things off today with Sarah. Sarah, tell us about Thread and where your passion comes from for the work that you do.
So first, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be with you and Joe and Rob. My passion really stems from kind of my childhood experiences. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, in a very religious family. And when I was about 8 years old, my parents found out the pastor of the church that we attended was misusing money. And when they revealed that, instead of firing the pastor, they decided they would shun our family. So from the time I was 8 to the time I was 16, I would go to church, sometimes 3 days a week, and no one could speak to me. Children, adults, aunts and uncles, cousins. And so, having gone through that very isolating experience, I kind of learned both the value of like how important it was that my family was so tight knit, but also how traumatic it was to feel less than human in a community that was supposed to love and support you. And so when I was then in high school, I met a young man who at the time was a straight A student, varsity athlete, getting ready to go to the Naval Academy. And I'd hear stories about his parents. His mom was a drug dealer. His dad was in prison. And these weren't the kind of rumors that were kind of common in my high school. And when he eventually explained it to me, it turned out his mom years earlier had been in a car accident. She was unable to walk. She lost her job. They lost their home. They moved from suburban Indianapolis to public housing. She became addicted to Dilaudid. And then she began selling drugs to support her own habit. And that all coincided with his transition into high school. And so he ended up missing more than 30 days of school and was really just on the verge of dropping out. And so there was a group of teachers who were like, yeah, no, we're not going to let that happen. And so they would drive to his house and give him a ride to school and bring him breakfast and make sure he had clean laundry. And so, they made the decision to go to school easier. It's easier to go to school if you don't have to take multiple buses and you aren't hungry and you're not worried about being teased because your clothing smells. So, for me, fast forward a bit, I joke my first strategic planning process was convincing him to date me and marry me. We've now been married 21 years. And he came out to Navy. I followed him. And when I was in graduate school, I just I'm very introverted. I didn't have any friends. And that experience triggered for me kind of the trauma from my childhood of feeling that sense of isolation. And so that's where my passion comes from. That's what started Thread. Was I just had this desire to find friends and people who would see me and know me and understand me. And I figured if I had that with Ryan, that there must be other high school students who were facing um, similar challenges outside of school ago. And so what we do is we enroll high school freshmen who academically rank in the bottom 25% of their class, but are extremely capable, brilliant, beautiful human beings, just distracted. And then they stay with us in Thread for 10 years. So it's longer than your average American marriage. And during that time, the idea is to form deeply mutual relationships, both with the young person, their family, and the family of 4 volunteers who are paired with that young person over time. And so that's really, really at the core of the work we do. I think while on the first day of Thread, we understood just how capable and brilliant and beautiful our young people were. I think the fundamental thing that I didn't have a full understanding of, and in some ways never fully will, is just how broken the systems were, and that how different even having some shared life experiences that Ryan has, that are my husband, that are overlapping with our young people, that as a white man, that the way that the systems of oppression have impacted our young people, that has been something that, over the last 16 years has driven kind of our overall approach and direction as a community, understanding that it's simply not enough to just, graduate from high school and go to college, because the world that a lot of our young people are stepping into has been intentionally made to not be meant for them. So that's also part of the work.
Oh, it's a very powerful story, Sarah, both personally and how you came to it after your studies. When we were talking on Tuesday this week, you brought up the concept of building relationships across lines of difference. Talk to us about that.
Well, I mean, relationships are hard in general. Anyone who's has family, we all do, knows that relationships, even parents, siblings, partners, are difficult, can be difficult and messy. And building relationships across lines of difference is especially, can be especially challenging. Part of the challenge is that the way our culture is built is that we default to a dominant set of norms in relationships, specifically a white dominant set of norms. And so part of the work in Thread is that over the last decade and a half, we've kind of established a set of norms that are non-dominant. So I'll give you just a quick example. We talk about in Thread calling a thing, telling the truth with kindness. If you can't tell someone they have spinach in their teeth, then how can you possibly tell them something they really need to hear? And so part of forming sticky relationships is equipping actually the adults on how to behave kind of in a non-dominant way, because the dominant structure would say to be polite. So our work is really, how do we build these deep and tight-knit relationships? But in order to do that, you have to have a set of norms within the community that are actually reflective and acknowledge and allow all people to feel seen and known and loved. So that's been the evolution of our work over time.
That's wonderful. So it's all about inclusivity. That's great. So let me shift gears from you, Sarah, for a moment and give Joe an opportunity to chime in. Joe, tell us about your mission and what it means for Baltimore and how that affects equity and opportunities for economic growth.
Yeah, our mission is to help strengthen urban communities by helping fathers and families achieve stability and economic success. And you mentioned it in the opening. And I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to be here, Christine, with you, and then with Sarah and Rob. But probably more importantly, to be here with the members who are, participating today to engage in this conversation. When I think about the work that we do, I come back to family, and not dissimilar, but in complementary ways to, what we've heard from Sarah. My upbringing informs how I think about the work that we do. growing up in Baltimore City and being an only child, and my parents' relationship struggling, and then that relationship disintegrating and then falling through the cracks. And I fell hard. And without getting into the gory details, I'm very, very fortunate with the God of my understanding and other people in my life, my support system, which is really important for everybody to have a support system to be able to make that rebound. And I was fortunate to, at a part of my professional journey, to land at the Baltimore City Health Department and working in maternal and child health. And what was very illuminating about that space that I was in at the health department is that the health department was heavily focused on reducing infant mortality by identifying every pregnancy in Baltimore City and encouraging those women to enroll in prenatal care and consistently. What the health department did not do was to understand that these women were pregnant by somebody and that other somebody was influencing their behavior, whether it was attending prenatal care, adhering to healthy principles of nutrition. And so we introduced this notion of including dads in the strategy to reduce infant mortality. Really wasn't a stretch for me, but it seemed to be foreign to the folks at the health department. And so we began to not only look at how to strengthen that family, since this was around the time of the birth, but also to look at the economic circumstances of the men and women who were about to be parents. And as we continued to look at that work, I decided to spin away from the health department and really appreciative of Mayor Kurt Smoke, who was supportive of me in the succeeding from the health department to be able to take the program staff and funding from the health department into the Center for Urban Families, which was founded in 1999. And over the last 2 decades, we have been focused maniacally on dismantling poverty within the context of our mission. And that is really looking at how do you create the conditions in community to help people to realize their full potential as it relates to being providers for themselves and their families. And the way that I kind of would want people to think about it from my context, particularly as it relates to urban America and Baltimore in particular, since we're here in the state of Maryland, is that there are and if you come back to 2015, at the time of the uprising around the death of Freddie Gray, we uncovered a whole set of inequities that many of us, I know for Sarah now, we've been working on for years, but for some people, particularly some of our civic and policy leaders and others and folks in philanthropy, it seemed to be an aha. You mean there's been this level of inequity that has existed? Yes, that's what's been happening. And it's almost as if there has been this big economic playing field. And all of us get an opportunity to play on that field, but there's a whole host of other community stakeholders who are on the sideline. They're looking at that economic playing field. They watch us play, but they don't get a chance to get on the field to play. And because of that, it leads to a set of frustrations and animosity, and it tends to create these two worlds, these differences between us and them. And how do you dismantle that? You do that by creating equitable opportunity, and you have to think about that in the context of existing structures, policies, and systems, and even the barriers within a company that would prevent somebody from moving up within that company, even if they had the competencies to do so. So our work has all been framed around social and economic mobility. And as we advance today, we're also thinking about doing that within a 2-generation lens, meaning how do we simultaneously work with adults or parents and their children, focusing on the adults' social and economic mobility and the children's academic success. That is the future for this organization, which I think complements well the work that Thread does. And we're proud partners in efforts between BG&E and Whiting Turner and work that we do in partnership together in the community, but at Touchpoint in Montgomery.
That's great. And can you just follow that with talking to me about some of the barriers that you found impact the fathers the most? Is it role model? Is it home environment, economics? What are the things that you're seeing are the biggest challenges there?
Well, it's both for not just fathers, but fathers and families. So it's men and women, but parents in general and individuals who may not be children. That's who our service base is. It's, folks who are 18 years of age and above, Baltimore City residents who fall into those demographic categories. But they're both challenges both on the personal level and on the macro or systemic level. And let me start with the systemic level. In Baltimore, we have actually six zip codes in Baltimore where there are, and follow the math if you would, 6 zip codes where there are approximately 10,000 individuals that are called non-custodial parents. And this group of 10,000 individuals owe an aggregate of $146 million in back state-owed child support, right? That's debt that is paid back to the state because children have received public benefits. It's not money that is paid back to the family. Those six zip codes are also 6 zip codes that are the recipients of the majority of people released from incarceration in the state of Maryland who come back to those zip codes. It also is replete with individuals who have had hopes and operations to advance economically, but are exploited. They're exploited by several different sectors. One is the proprietary for-profit learning institutions that require these folks to take out student loans, averaging between $8,000 and $10,000, and there's no real meaningful outcome on the back end in terms of a certification or advancement or connection to a job associated with a particular discipline. It is also associated with, if you look at COVID in our current environment, and we look at the disparities in the number of people who are of color who are impacted differently than other communities. And unless you disaggregate data, it's really difficult to understand how some of the structures in our system are not necessarily conducive for people of color to advance. But then if you drill it down to the to the individual level, what I really appreciate is I call myself a recovering knucklehead. So I say this very affectionately. I love working with recovering people who are knuckleheads who are looking to recover, right? And to help unpack for them what their goals and aspirations are. What are the gifts that God has given you that you never really had the opportunity to be on in an environment that supports that? And then how do you funnel that? And as people begin to respect and trust you, right? That mutual trust and respect. And you create these opportunities, and here, connecting them to our employer partners, you begin to see them thrive. What is missing from that is the recognition of how long they have been in a hole and how much support is necessary for them to receive. So when you hear Sarah talk about being with students for 10 years, we're with our adult parents and individuals for 3 to 5 years. It is a fallacy to think that in 6 months to a year, we are going to create these microwave success stories. And so we have to be thoughtful around really what that means. And the other side of that on the individual level is what I call this theory of boat management, like literally giving a person a boat and telling them that they're in the ocean and because of the barriers that they face, they're going to be rowing against the tide, against the stream, if you will. But who is in your boat, your social network, helps to determine whether or not you can reach your destination. If you have people that are in your boat who are rowing in the opposite direction or who may not be rowing at all, you got some serious decisions to make about who and how you manage your social network. So those are all things that wrapped into what it takes in dealing with systems and policy, but also at the individual level. But the other side of it is really what we do with employer partners and how important it is for employers to understand the structures, the systems within their individual businesses that may or may not promote advancement.
That's great. I love the metaphor of the boat, and it's powerful, and it applies to so many things. I can think even about my own workplace or my own family, and I'm going to use that. I'll give you credit for it, though.
Please use it.
Good, I will. So let's turn to Robert now and get him engaged in this conversation. Robert, tell us about Exelon Utilities' commitment to workforce initiatives in the communities that you serve and the benefits to the businesses and communities and workers. Please.
Good morning to you. Thanks, Christine. It's good to be with you today, and thank you to the Chamber and for BG for hosting this, and to my esteemed colleagues, Joe and Sarah. It's good to be with you, and it's also good to follow you because you've said much of all the important stuff. BGE and Exelon Utilities and Pepco Maryland, Delaware Power. Our commitment, and Joe captured it, is focused on the reality that there are economic inequities and disadvantages in the communities where we serve. So in various places and cities in Maryland, when you look at where there's disproportionate unemployment and income levels and wage gaps, we see the results of structural and institutional racism and inequities. And so our commitment is, in light of those realities in these communities that we care about, we want to do something about that. And so we've committed resources and dollars to create opportunities so that those in underserved and underinvested communities really have that opportunity. So to Joe's analogy, first analogy, that they're not kind of banned to the sideline and not restricted from play on the economic field. And what that looks like specifically, we've outlined 4 priorities that involved first, STEM education and awareness. It's our way of looking at a multi-generational approach. We start with creating education awareness with middle school students, so they understand where the career opportunities are with STEM, and not just awareness of the opportunities, but the reality that participants in STEM careers is significantly less among Black and Brown communities. So creating that awareness, providing that. One thing we do in the summers, we take high school young ladies off to a college campus, and we engage them in a STEM-related project. And we do at the beginning an assessment to say, what's your level of interest? What's your level of knowledge in energy and STEM? And then we spend a week with them, and at the end we see how that's changed. And so we recognize that from a STEM education awareness standpoint, that we need to make that investment earlier on, plant those seeds, so that in years and years and years to come, that we can change the dynamics of those who are involved. The second is barrier reduction and elimination, recognizing that we are part of, as I mentioned, structural issues and the results of those. And so we're trying to, in the policies and practices, to dismantle those. We're looking at pre-employment tests and interview readiness and so forth, ensuring that those playing fields are leveled and that there's maximum participation. One example of that in Baltimore in particular is we've worked with the South Baltimore Learning Center to offer a CAS test, and that's the construction and skilled trades test that's required for entry into the entry-level jobs at the utilities. And so that course is taught, and it's free to the community, the prep course information that readies those who might be interested. The third is opportunity creation and partnership. And that's where we create both with high schools or youth and with work-ready adults opportunities for entry into family supporting careers. In Baltimore, for example, we partner with Civic Works and Ferguson Trenching, which is one company, one contractor. And so it's a workforce collaborative or infrastructure academy where work-ready adults are trained in entry-level construction for a period of weeks. And of course, as mentioned by Sarah and Joe, the appropriate wraparound services and support services are provided by Civic Works. And then after their graduation, they enter into those companies that are sponsoring it. And many of them, I think at the moment, 30 or 38 or so have been placed and are entering into family supporting wage jobs. And so we also have a program with the local high schools where they are involved in trade programs. So they're going into high school saying, hey, when I leave high school, I want to enter a career work. And so they've chosen to go to a vocational trade school. And we're partnering with those schools to ensure that there's a pipeline from those programs into our work. And sorry, I don't want the school folks to get upset with me. I think we call them CTE schools, or career technology education programs these days. And then finally, the fourth component of priority is our thought leadership. And we understand the voice that we have at Exelon Utilities to ensure that we're being pioneers at this space. We've committed to want to be as good at this work and economic empowerment and workforce development as we are at everything else we do. And so we want to offer our thought leadership to our companies in our industry and other industries as well. And so we're committed to doing this. And as I mentioned, over $8 million across our company invested in doing this work across several of our cities.
That's great, Robert. Thank you. And you are so right. I get to brag on you guys a little bit because I have Whiting Turner sits on my board of directors, as does BG&E. And you guys really, really step up to the plate and you walk the walk. We had one of our foundation's teacher externs, the plumbing teacher at Mervo High School, spent 4 weeks last summer working with the folks at BG&E. And he was so excited when he got back to his classroom to be able to tell the students about 187 different positions that they could consider going into right out of high school. So that is a big, big thing for a kid to understand, boy or girl, sitting there in the classroom, that they can go into a trade, a technical trade, and earn a living wage and have a career ladder. So that's really wonderful. But, you know, on Tuesday when we were practicing for today's webinar, you told a really impactful story about a leadership meeting that you were in, and there were only men in the room. So first of all, thank you for recognizing that there were only men in the room. As a woman who grew up with 5 brothers, I appreciate that very much. Talk to us about that meeting and what you did next.
Yeah, sure. It was actually a meeting between 2 very big companies, and these companies were coming together to think about innovation strategies and efficiency, streamlining opportunities to make the partnership more strong and to make their products and services in partnership more strong. And so we were in the virtual room, and as it sometimes happened, I manage a pretty healthy attention deficit thing. So I start to kind of look around who's there and who's not there, and is everybody as handsome as me? So I'm looking there, and I noticed something. I noticed that it's only men. And I check and confirm a few times, and then I sent a note to a colleague to make sure that I wasn't like misseeing what I was seeing, and he confirmed it. And now he acknowledged that there were some colleagues who should have been there who had a conflict and were not able to be there. But the point still holds the same, that somehow we had come together to do this important work, this required work, and yet we did not take account for a large segment and an important element of our workforce was not there, which absolutely means we could never get to the best product without a significant component being there. And so I deliver like a motivational moment or talk later in the week, and I wrote about it. And I drew an analogy between how we're often on mute talking on the virtual calls that we're on, and drawing a difference between where we are on mute because we forget to unmute ourselves, and where there are segments of the population, of our employee groups, of our community who have been muted. Or who have not been allowed to come off mute because we've not invited them to the conversation. And so what I did next was I challenged the group in that meeting to say, look around and see what's happening. And this tendency, it disproportionately impacts the communities that several of both of the companies we're trying to serve, and that we had to be deliberate and intentional about dismantling not just the tendency in that moment, but where it's structurally in place. And so our company is committed to my work, my personal life's work is committed to ensuring that we give space to those who don't have voices in as many ways as we can.
That's wonderful, Robert. And again, I just appreciate that the gender issue is part of the conversation. One of the resources that we will post after this webinar is a report that recently came out by McKinsey & Company. And one of the statistics that I read was that only 3% of C-suite level individuals are African American women. 3% of the C-suite, and we're not talking CEOs. So I thought that was a really powerful statistic. And I think it's the kind of conversation that everyone needs to be aware of, including myself as an employer. So thank you. So looking ahead for a moment, I'd like each, go ahead, Robert.
And I was agreeing that we have work to do.
We do. And I'm glad that we're talking about it. And so are the folks in the chat box. They appreciate that this is something that is at the fore and that you're discussing it with your peers. That's a big deal, is having those conversations, and as a leader, recognizing, but then speaking about them. So moving ahead, let's look forward. There are gigantic challenges looming right now related to this pandemic, let alone everything else that's going on in a normal day-to-day. And Sarah, you made a comment on Tuesday about the normal chaos of the ecosystem that all of the kids live in, and throwing the pandemic on top of it, what that's meant, and even just the impact of educating and trying to get educated. So when you look at the ecosystem, could each of you share what's the most important thing that's on your mind going to the future? Sarah, we'll start with you.
Well, I think I'm an eternal optimist. And so we've been really thinking about, in this moment, both of COVID and racial reckoning, that there's actually an opportunity as systems and structures are falling apart to actually build them in a new and better way. And just really trying to pay attention to where is the opportunity to do things different. So one example that we've experienced was just super basic. In the first few days of COVID, we decided with Thread that we would literally we transitioned our staff to remote, and then we said, we're going to call every single young person and every single volunteer and just ask a simple question like, are you okay? Because it wasn't just our young people, our volunteers, many of them are university students. They were having to move out of their dorms, go back home. I mean, it was chaotic. But what we heard overwhelmingly from our young people was during this moment where people were being asked to stay home, and we were doing things like loading up on groceries in our house, they were being asked to go to different sites to access meals. And so that's choice between, protecting yourself from COVID, but then also like being able to access food doesn't really feel like a choice. So we initially just started delivering groceries to young people's homes, and quickly realized that that was not sustainable, scalable, that would create a challenge. And so what we ended up doing was partnering with Whiting Turner, Wes Moore and his wife Dawn, Baltimore Core, who is also a partner at Touchpoint along with us, and formed something called Food with a Focus. And so what we've been doing is buying groceries in bulk, 2 weeks worth of groceries, and then having them distributed across 18 different sites, churches, synagogues, community organizations. And so what that's enabled us to do is, one, keep jobs, some of the service jobs at these food distributors where they had been supplying restaurants and initially hadn't pivoted their business and were in danger of actually losing, having to lay people off. But it's also then buying in bulk and being able to get weeks of groceries out to families through these sites. And so then it's also created this additional ripple effect of relationships being built within those neighborhoods amongst those distributing the food and those picking it up. And so now we've fed through this process over 23,000 families with more than 500,000 pounds of food. So I say that because the immense amount of, I don't know what the emotion is to tag exactly, but just the fact that this is not just the pandemic, our young people have, as Joe was talking about, challenges with food security all the time. And so when you think about how, for example, summers have been handled and how food is in general, the food distribution mechanisms for the summers for young people, even not in COVID, feels like a blind spot. Like, why did we not come up with a better solve sooner? And so COVID has actually broken it open. And now we can think about, okay, these solutions both apply now to get food distributed, but it also applies, I think, post-COVID in a, how do we over the summers ensure that the 80,000 young people in the Baltimore City public school system have adequate access to nutrition. So that's just like one example, but you could certainly dive into all the, technology challenges, childcare. I mean, the challenges are just immense, but I also think they're an opportunity to build something that's more equitable and also just more efficient. I think we have all the resources that we need. It's a matter of, as a community, are they being leveraged in a way that actually brings about more equity?
That's great. That's a great story and a great example of why weren't we trying to solve things differently? My husband's an 8th grade science teacher, and we've talked about the virtual delivery of education, and wondered why weren't we talking about this sooner, right? The internet's been here for a long time. So Joe, let's go to you. When you look at the entire ecosystem, what's on your mind most for the future?
First and foremost is thinking about how do we help our immediate stakeholders and in the broader community, both locally and nationally. How do we heal? I don't know about you. I feel exhausted. I'm not tired, but I'm just mentally exhausted from all that we went through. And, I think it's fair to say that everybody that I'm looking at on the screen, including myself, we're privileged. But there are people who don't have the ability to escape exhaustion. They've got to endure it. All of us to some degree because of constraints around COVID and, the new surge are restricted from how we move, but we have options. When you have limited options and you're exhausted, then you start to do things that are counter to what we would want people to consider, because they literally have to get away from this stuff at some point in time. And then how do we rebuild trust, and reciprocal relationships that will allow us to understand where each other are. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I'm coming back to. Early 2019, one of our employer partners, I won't mention the company because it quite honestly could be on, but this was a company that we have a great relationship, and they hire we refer to our clients as members. They hire our members. And as the relationship matured early last year, they invited me to come to an annual convening to address their senior leadership team and their second level managers. And they had always talked to me about how inclusive they were as a workplace, but our access to them was at the hiring manager level. So I go out to this company. I'm really, really excited. It takes me quite a while to get there because of where they were located. And I get into the room. And as soon as I get in, I notice I am the only person of color in this room. But they told me they were inclusive, and we had our managers there. And what was obvious is that somewhere within their ecosystem, they did not have opportunities for advancement that was apparent to someone who they invited in as a guest and somewhat of a quote unquote family member, since we have this employer-employee relationship. And as I began to talk, just thinking about, I forget how Sarah actually worded it, but she was talking about if you can't tell somebody that they have spinach on their teeth, or how can you be honest and open about other things? And I decided in that moment, because I hadn't anticipated doing this, because I thought the environment would have been, just from a diversity standpoint, much different than what I observed. And I shared with them the optics, exactly what lens I saw as I was looking at their manager and above workforce. And that led to us having a series of conversations, and they started to do some work. And so I think about, as we look into the future and we get beyond this exhaustion and we get back to some level of trust and reciprocal trust among friends and neighbors, how do we come back to this, creating this equitable playing field that gives more people an opportunity to earn a living wage and take advantage of, the opportunities that exist within companies in our area? And how do we call out structural challenges? How do we help an employer to understand that, potentially, have you done any analysis of your HR hiring practices? Is the HR department a bottleneck and creating or limiting opportunities for people to move forward. So how do we do those kind of analyses, but how do we do it in partnership and not us versus them, not in this polarized environment that really limited opportunity for partnership? So that for me is front and center. And then, I always end on where are we and what are we going to do for families? Children deserve, and honestly, they get their first start. Their first teacher are their parents. And depending on the circumstances of that parent or those parents, it will determine what kind of start the child gets off to. Is it a start where you're starting from behind the start line, or are you at the start line? And are you getting a push and the kind of support that will allow you to be ready for early childhood education? And so that we don't have kids falling through the cracks, trying to make up. And on the back end of that, we have folks like the for-profit prison industry who are looking at the data around children falling through the cracks and start to make and plan strategies where they talk with legislators and policymakers about building juvenile and adult criminal justice institutions based on data. And they will tell you that we can't wait to build a prison because the numbers that we're looking at in terms of the deficits from children suggest we should build now. So that ecosystem includes all of that stuff. And we have to be open and honest about what that means in 2020 going into 2021. And to be honest with you, the only people who are going to create these conditions of mutual respect and trust and opportunity are all of us. It is nobody else's fault. It's not the children's fault. It is the adults who have responsibility and control over the systems of opportunity.
Wow. Amen to that. We talk so much of what you just said. We talk about here at the Chamber, the equity of opportunity. And when we think about the change, when you have an incarcerated citizen who does have a family, when you can return them to the community and they find gainful employment, the change for the child to suddenly have stability in their home, to have food on the table every night, to be able to sleep in a bed and then go to school and actually be ready to learn, to have the capacity to learn. We really think that's the fastest way to reducing crime and enhancing quality of life for everyone. And you're exactly correct. It's everyone's problem. And we all need to help find a solution. So you've got a friend in us for sure here at the Chamber. So Robert, you have a complex ecosystem. The Exelon utility companies are all very engaged in this. What's most on your mind for the future?
I'll tell a quick story. I'm on the board of Bon Secours Baltimore Foundation, and about a little over a year ago, we were preparing for groundbreaking over in West Baltimore, zip code 21223, for a community center that's being built in partnership with Kaiser Permanente, our partner in that area. And I was standing outside on a conference call. This was, October 2019, BC, before COVID. So we were allowed to be outside, and I was standing there on a call. A young lady walks by, and she says, "What are we doing here today? What are you guys doing?" And I explained that we were breaking ground on this community resource center, and so today would be the ceremonial kind of tossing over the dirt and cutting the ribbon, and we would be starting this project, and it would be a community center where your family members could come and be served in workforce development and training and resources, computer labs and the like. And she said, okay. She walked away, turned around and came back, and she said, "What are you guys doing here today?" And my first inclination, as my mom or dad would have said, is, "Listen here, little girl, I already told you what we're doing here," but I didn't. I explained it again: a resource center that would be available for families and to come and get served, and computer centers and the like. She turned, walked away, and came back again, and she said, "Am I welcomed here?" And I thought she had asked me the same question again because she didn't hear me, or that she wasn't listening. And what I realized is that she was listening, but she was listening to see if in all this work we were doing right in her community, if she heard herself or saw herself being a part. And what's on my mind and on my company's mind is, are we doing enough to ensure that the communities where we live and operate and serve, that we are doing enough across the spectrums that we work in how we service customers and what our policies and practices are, both in the legislative and regulatory space. Are they broad enough to not just favor a certain segment of customers or a certain segment of customers with a certain income? What are we doing to Joe's point about ensuring that there's opportunity up and down the leadership spectrum? Are we looking internally and holding ourselves accountable as well? Are we ensuring that there's an equity lens in everything we do? And I believe that our company, the company I work for, supports that, looks at that. But what the last several months have caused us to realize is that we have to be even more committed to that work and ensuring that we're thinking about Jasmine, and that was the young lady's name, who was walking by. And we have to be concerned about what our community members understood and thought, and even concerned about who's standing out front and what is the message, who's looking out for the community, and how far out front are they standing? Are they right in front, or are they deeply embedded in the community so that we can connect? So we have to maintain an equity lens in everything we do and hold ourselves accountable with the effort of trying to make a meaningful, impactful difference.
That's great. That's so important, is to remain open and to put the equity lens onto everything that you're viewing. I think that's really right on point, Robert. I would like to encourage our participants to put questions into the chat feature. We're going to go to audience questions at this time. And the first question that I have is starting with you, Sarah. Let's talk about a success story that you want to share with everyone that will provide the audience with maybe some additional motivation and excitement about how they can begin to take action that will make an impact.
Oh, starting in the micro and moving to the macro, there's just been so many success stories just in the past few months, from, volunteers waking up every morning and making sure a young person is logged into Google Classrooms and is getting their work done and has the laptop they need and has the Wi-Fi, to our volunteers and young people going fly fishing or doing socially distanced walks, or I think a lot of times we're looking for these big things, and really what matters is accumulated small wins, because it's the demonstration that it's possible to have these relationships in this way. Is, the visual, Joe, of like, who's in my boat, whose boat am I in, as you were talking, right? And I think that's what Thread does. Like, we help people, find their people, their bat cave of humans who are going to have their back at 3 a.m. But there's also the big wins, like for young people that have been part of Thread since the beginning. Just in the past few months, we had one of our alumni get married, and another had a child, and another buy their first home. And so, I think when you look at Baltimore City, and 6% of young people who have GPAs of less than 1.0 graduate from high school in 4 years. In Thread, that number is 69%. And if you extend out 6 years, it's 84%. So our young people are beyond capable. And it's, and they're also when we look at our staff team, to your point about how the table is constructed, both Joe and Rob, to have Kendall and Shawanda and Devin leading inside of our staff team now, this many years later, it's just that I think is where the real change is happening. I will say just really quickly, in case it's of help to anyone else on kind of an equity journey, or more specifically an anti-racism journey, there's been 2 frameworks that I've both been using as an individual and in my role in Thread. The first kind of gets at, there's 5 socio-ecological domains that we've all been talking about. So the first is the individual domain. So what is our perspective, what is the bias that we have that's been accumulated over time. There's the interpersonal, so like the relationships that we have with others. And then there's the organizational, so it's, you know, within your company, what are the policies, HR, hiring, all of that. Then there's community, so what are the loose ties? And then there's policy. And really, to get to a more equitable culture, we need, and a society, we need to have change in all 5 domains. And I think sometimes we get these fits and starts in one domain or another, and what we need is a unified effort. And so I think oftentimes we also forget about the critical aspect of just the internal work of interrogating our own bias on the individual level and how that impacts our organizations. So just thinking about that, you know, just wanted to share that as well as it's just a critical piece that then supports the other domains. And the other is just for those who are in positions of power, like talking actively about power and interrogating power and thinking about power in 3 different dimensions. So there's visible power, like who's the mayor or the CEO, but there's also hidden power. It's the person who's actually, or people who are actually setting the table and driving the decisions. And so it's who knows the rules of the game. Like, how can you engage in a game if you don't know the rules? And a lot of times hidden power is the group that understands the rules, which then is a barrier to inclusion. And then the last form of power being the invisible power. So it's the way that messages shape our way of internalizing who we are and how we fit in the situation. My guess is everyone, to varying degrees, is impacted or holds all 3 of these types of power, but thinking about how those play out in organizations and really interrogating it actively over time. You know, Rob, to your story, like that's a form of power that you held, right? And how, you know, how you use that power is really, I think, how each of us use the power that we do have in various settings is how we start to think about bringing, you know, greater change.
That's great. The 3 types of power, that's also really poignant and a great thing to think about and remember as leaders in our organizations, to take a look and see who's wielding what power. Other examples of successes that either Robert or Joe would like to share?
Well, I'll lift up one that, you kind of, this is around relationships. I'm going to do it within the context of our mission. So there's a group of young people that are commonly referred to in the human services sector as opportunity youth. These are folks 18 to 24 who've been touched by the criminal justice system, but they haven't been so immersed in it that the prospects of them coming out are still, relatively high. And we're working with this young man who, he's a knucklehead, he was a kid doing knucklehead stuff, and he got caught up. And we got to him, and he's making the changes. He's struggling, but he's making the changes. He takes 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 1 step forward, and he stumbles, but he's a work in progress, and he's making that turn, and you can see it. It's visual. And this one particular evening, he had gotten paid from a starter job, and he was hit by a truck and left in the middle of the street for dead. He was in a rehab facility. My wife and I went to see him, and I was really nervous about going to see him, but his optimism, when we sat in the rehab center, with him, he's paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. And all he cared about was his daughter, and wanted to make sure that when she saw him, she did not see somebody who was defeated. And so we found out that he was going to be released from the rehab center. He was going home. But then we found out that the wheelchair that he was going to be released with would not fit through the door of their small home. And we don't have resources to address those kind of issues. So I did what most of us would do. We pick up and we call whoever we think we can call to help. In this particular instance, I called Tim Reagan, the CEO of Whiting Turner, and said, "Tim, this is the issue. This is what we're dealing with." He said, "Okay, Joe, let me look into it." Right. Then he calls me back. He said, "Do you know what you got me into?" And I said, what, Tim? He said, first of all, it's not just a door. It's some other stuff structurally about that frame. There's also a bunch of stuff in the back of the yard, including an old car that we're going to have to move out of there, right? So then he started laughing. He said, but we're going to get this done. And what came from that is Tim had his crew at Whiting Turn to go over and restructure that doorway. Not only that, but he built a ramp so that he could get through the doorway. And it's those kind of the power of relationships and being able to lean on one another that creates the sense of humanity. And I'll leave it there.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's great. Robert?
Yeah, I know we're watching time.
I know.
It was summer 2019, and BGE was graduating its first class of their workforce collaborative. We were, I think, over at Lake Clifton campus, and I was scheduled to just do one part of the program, and as I stood up to the microphone, I noticed that one of the participants in the class, he and I actually grew up in the same neighborhood. I was at in the North and Gay area. I was at Lafayette and Montford, and he was at Montford and Lanville. And I noticed him. I could tell he hadn't noticed me yet. So I got to the microphone and I told a story about us growing up and us being a bit of knuckleheads, like Joe says it. But when I called out to him and called him by his nickname, which was Eggy, I didn't even know his real name because we just called each other by nicknames. And at that moment, I realized that we had come from the same neighborhood and ended up in different places. But it was because of the grace of God that I was in a position to influence a company like the one I work for, Exelon Utilities and BGE and the like, to be making that type of investment. And so that his path was slightly different, that we came together at that moment for him Jermaine to be able to graduate a program, now is in a full-time job, making a difference for his family, making a difference in his community. And that the experiences that he had in his past, some of them structurally set up, that did not prohibit him from being able to participate fully in the economic opportunities that exist. And so my success story is that we've got multiple opportunities and chances, and that we've got to be committed to providing those, not just to some, but to all. And I'm grateful to have been able to be a part of it.
That's powerful, Robert. Thank you for sharing that. We have one question in the chat feature that I'd like to finish with, and if you could briefly talk about from Bernard Sims. Good morning. Are your companies enrolling in intentional training on diversity, equity, and inclusion for top leadership? Any of you want to address that?
Yeah, I jump in. I'll say yes. And I look quickly at the attendees. Steve Warner, who is the president COO of BGE, and other executives throughout the company have participated in an intense multi-day, 3.5-day learning lab that explores white privilege and supremacy, and how we are a culture that is largely white, male, straight, Christian dominated, and all the biases that we bring to this culture in which we live. And it's an introspective examination over multiple days of looking at bias and privilege. And it's intense. And all of the executives at the company have gone through it. And now, as we move to lead the organization, it's those types of things that have enabled us at this moment to lead, having done that work. It's not as simple as just completing that. And it's not just a training, it really is an experiential experience and introspection that allows us to see where we are and who we need to become.
That's great, Robert. And I know that you are very intentional about this. So we're out of time here this morning. And I just want to thank all three of you so much for your inspiring stories. We will put the resources from your organizations up on the Chamber website with the recording of this webinar so that it can be viewed by folks at any time after this. And on behalf of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce Foundation, I want to thank all three of you for everything that you and your organizations are doing to make a difference. I want to thank BG&E again for sponsoring this series. And I want everyone to look forward to January. We'll have another important conversation to be the fourth part of the 6-part series. So thank you again. Please stay well and enjoy the holiday with your families. Have a great day.
Thank you, Christy.
You're welcome.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays to you.
Thank you.